Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm Paul Collier, and I thought I'd talk about something that's maybe a little bit unfashionable in focus on developing countries, and that is urbanization. A lot of people who work on developing countries tend to focus on the rural, with the mantra that's where the poor people are. But the reason there are so many people living in rural areas, and the reason they're poor, is that certainly in Africa, the cities have failed to become engines of opportunity. No country anywhere has developed without urbanization. And so, whilst people are bottled up in rural areas, they're doomed to poverty. And so in fixing rural poverty, the key focus is trying to make Africa's cities more prosperous. And a good city is a sort of economic miracle. It generates very large rents that are locationally specific. And it does that partly through making places that are good places to live, because it harnesses scale economies in public services, schools, clinics and so on, and partly because it makes ordinary people productive. And it does that partly by clustering firms together. There are economies from clustering firms together. That's why you get, for example, one city in China has 70% of all the button makers in the world. So that's a cluster with reaping scale economies. And then an efficient city also creates economies of a market. You get consumers all clustered together. And finally you get workers close to the places where they work. So people are living and within commuting distance of employment opportunities. So these are the scale economies that generate location-specific rents. And what they depend upon is high density, especially high residential density. So an efficient city achieves density without a loss of quality of life by building upwards. And a city in a poor country would typically build residential accommodation 4 or 5 story apartment blocks. Higher than that, and you need lifts, which are expensive. Lower than that, and you're not achieving enough density. But if you look at Africa's cities, very seldom will you see 4 or 5 story apartment blocks. What you'll see is most people living in slums, in shacks, in single story shacks. And so if the residences achieve density, and sometimes they do, but they achieve it at the cost of livability, because people are so crowded together that they have very little living space. And there's also very few public service provided, not even basic things like water, sanitation. That happened in Africa, so Africa's cities look like they do, because there's been no process of public policy planning the city and implementing the infrastructure in advance of settlement. Instead, people have moved first. So you can think of a city as 3 investment processes. People invest in housing, firms invest in factories, commercial property, and government invests in infrastructure. And the vital thing is the sequence in which that happens. Governments need to move first and provide the infrastructure. In Africa, the people move first and set up shacks, basically. So, how do we avoid that happening again and again? It's a very important issue because Africa is the least urbanized continent, and it's only about a third of the way through its urbanization process. By 2050, Africa's cities will have tripled their population, so 2/3 of the African city is yet to be built. That's a huge opportunity to get things right first time. It's much cheaper to build a city right first time than to retrofit a decent city on top of a slum. But the default option is repeat history, and Africa's history of urbanization so far has been pretty disastrous. So it's not a fashionable policy issue, but it's hugely important. If Africa's cities don't work, Africa will stay poor. Thanks very much.